Ever get that feeling, like when a company's saying, oh, we need your data for this, and you're not so sure they actually do? Like, do they really need my shoe size to fill out this survey? Today's deep dive is all about that legitimate interest line companies use and how to know if it's, well, actually legit.
And it's perfect timing because the EDPB, those are the data protection experts over in the EU, they just put out brand new guidelines this October, all about Article 6.1 of the GDPR. That's where legitimate interest lives, legally speaking.
Okay, before we lose anyone thinking this is just, lawyer stuff, why should we care what the EU's doing with data?
Because even if you're not in the EU yourself, chances are good the companies you're using, they are. And these guidelines, they're not just about checking boxes. They set a higher bar for how companies can actually use your data, even if you haven't explicitly given them the green light.
It's about striking that balance between a company's right to do business and your right to, well, not have your data used in ways you wouldn't be cool with.
Which is where our deep dive comes in. We're tackling these brand new guidelines from the EDPB.
Right.
Think of them as the rulebook for Article 6.1F of the GDPR if you want to get technical.
Hot off the press, adopted just days ago on October 8th, 2024.
So fresh insights into when organizations can say, hey, we have a legitimate interest in using your data for this.
And believe me, these guidelines are relevant to anyone who uses the internet, which is, well, pretty much everyone these days.
No more legal jargon, though. We're breaking it all down into plain English. What do you need to know about how this impacts your digital life?
Because, let's face it, data protection can be a bit of a maze sometimes. These guidelines are all about bringing some much-needed clarity to this whole legitimate interest thing.
Because it can't just be a free-for-all, right? Companies can't just take our data on a joyride, even if they think it's for a good reason.
You hit the nail on the head. The GDPR is very clear. If a company's trying to use legitimate interest as a sneaky way to bypass stricter rules, not going to happen. They've got to be upfront, transparent, and prove they've really done their homework before they even think about processing your info.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole legitimate interest concept a bit. Because it's got to be more than just a company going, trust us, it's in our interest, no worries.
Oh, you're catching on quickly. The guidelines lay out some very specific, very important must-haves for an interest to even earn the legitimate stamp of approval.
So no more vague hand-waving. Give us the rundown. What does the law actually say?
First and foremost, the interest has to be lawful. And we're talking squeaky clean here. It can't violate any EU law or the laws of any EU country.
So no declaring open season on data just because it's a Tuesday and someone feels like it. Got it.
Precisely. It has to be completely by the book, totally legal. And hold on, we're not done yet. On top of being lawful, that interest, it has to be crystal clear. Companies need to define it in detail, not just throw out some vague, it's for the greater good type of justification.
So less, we need to protect our business, and more, we're using this data to prevent credit card fraud.
Now you're getting it. And here's the real kicker. The interest can't be some far-off hypothetical thing. It's got to be real. It's got to be current. It's got to be happening right now when they're processing that data.
Yeah. To really hammer this home, let's look at some real-world examples straight from the guidelines. Let's say I'm an e-cigarette company, and I'm dying to blast out promo emails to every person with an inbox. Sounds like a business interest, right?
Marketing in itself can be a legitimate interest for sure, but, and this is a big but, context is key. Let's say you're sending those e-cig ads to a country where, oh, by the way, e-cigarette advertising is banned.
Suddenly, not so legitimate anymore.
Bingo. It's not just about what the company wants. It's about what's actually allowed, what aligns with the law of the land. Context is everything.
It's like saying I have a totally legit interest in driving super fast, but then remembering, oh, right, speed limits. Those exist for a reason.
Perfect analogy. Or picture this. You've got a neighborhood watch group, well-intentioned for sure, but they're really into surveillance. We're talking cameras everywhere. And their reasoning, it's for safety, the greater good.
Even with good intentions, that sounds a tad intense.
And that's where the guidelines step in and say, hold up a sec. That's way too vague. What specific threats are we talking about here? Whose safety are we trying to protect exactly? The greater good doesn't cut it.
It's like saying I need to buy every book in the bookstore just in case I want to read it someday. A little extreme, don't you think?
Exactly. Hypotheticals don't fly when it comes to data protection. It's about concrete actions, real and present dangers.
So if I dream of opening a bakery someday, which, by the way, is a real goal that doesn't give me the right to collect everyone's data, just in case they might want a cupcake later.
As much as I support your entrepreneurial spirit, and those cupcakes do sound amazing, the answer is a resounding no. This is about protecting people's information, not enabling a free-for-all data grab.
Right, because we're talking about personal data here, not flour and sugar.
Yeah.
But hold on, it's not always about a company's own interests, right? Sometimes they might use our data to help out someone else.
You're right, it's not always so black and white. Article 6(1)(f) also covers situations where a company processes data for a third party's legitimate interest.
Okay, now I'm really interested. How does that work in practice?
Let me set the scene. Imagine you're cruising down the street on your scooter, feeling good, enjoying the ride. Suddenly, bam, a taxi door swings open right into your path. Scratch scooter, not so happy rider.
Definitely not the smooth ride I signed up for.
Exactly. Now, you need the passenger's insurance info, right? But the taxi company is the one holding those cards. This is where legitimate interest for a third party comes into play.
So the taxi company could share the passenger's info with me, the scooter owner, even though it doesn't directly benefit them, because I have a legitimate interest in getting those repairs covered.
You've got it. It's about demonstrating that clear link. Why is this data being used and whose interest does it really serve? And sometimes that interest belongs to someone else entirely.
So it's a broader principle than just companies looking out for number one. It's about fairness, making sure the right info gets to the right people when they need it.
Exactly. And it highlights how these data rights are not just some abstract legal concept. They have real-world consequences. They play out in everyday situations like this.
Okay, so we've covered what makes an interest legitimate. It has to be lawful, it has to be specific, it has to be happening right now, and it could be for the company or someone else entirely. But here's my question. Just because an interest ticks all those boxes, does that mean a company can go on a data collecting spree? Like, is it a free pass to gather all the data they can get their hands on?
That's where the next crucial piece of the puzzle comes in, necessity. And when the GDPR says necessary, they really mean it. We're talking high standards here.
All right, spill the tea. What does necessary actually mean in GDPR terms? What's the threshold?
It's not enough for something to be helpful or convenient. It has to be absolutely essential for achieving that legitimate interest we were just talking about. Think of it like this. It's the difference between needing a glass of water and wanting to hoard the entire ocean. Companies can't just go around scooping up all your data just in case it might be useful down the road. The processing has to be truly, deeply, absolutely crucial to that specific goal they've laid out. No exceptions.
So no more digital hoarding, just in case. Love that. Sounds like it's all about efficiency and, not treating our data like it's nobody's business.
You've got it. It's about respect, too. And it goes even deeper than that. When figuring out if something is necessary, the guidelines say companies have to keep in mind the data minimization principle, one of the core ideas behind the GDPR.
Data minimization. Refresh my memory on that one again. It's been a while since law school.
Basically, it means companies can only collect and use the absolute bare minimum amount of data they need to accomplish their goal. No grabbing extra data just because.
So if we're ordering a pizza, we're picking the toppings we actually want. We're not just saying, give me one of everything, just because we can.
Perfect analogy. Data minimization in a nutshell. And remember, this whole is it really necessary assessment, that has to happen up front before any processing takes place, not as an afterthought once the data is already in their hands.
Which is great for us because it means companies can't just hoover up everything and then figure out what to do with it later. I like it. But there's another layer to this, isn't there? It's not just about companies deciding what they need. It's about what we're comfortable with, too, right? How do our own rights and freedoms factor into all of this?
You're right on the money. That's where things get really juicy. We've talked about how an interest has to be legitimate, lawful, specific, current, all that good stuff. And the processing itself has to be necessary, absolutely essential. Well, the third piece of this puzzle, and some might say the most important piece when it comes to legitimate interest, is the balancing act.
Ooh, the balancing act.
Yes.
Sounds intense.
Yeah.
So it's not enough for a company to just say, look, we have a legit interest, we swear, and yeah, it's totally necessary for us to use your data this way. There's more to it.
Way more. Their interest, even if it seems reasonable at first glance, can't outweigh the potential impact on your fundamental rights and freedoms. And the GDPR is all about protecting individuals, so this balancing test, it puts you right at the center.
All right, I'm all about putting the power back in the hands of the people. So break it down for me. How does this balancing act actually work? What factors are we weighing here?
It all starts with you, your interests. your fundamental rights and freedoms. And we're not just talking about data privacy here, although that's a big one. We're talking the whole shebang. Your freedom of expression, your right to security, protection from discrimination, the right to your physical and mental integrity, all of it. Because the guidelines recognize that data processing can have a ripple effect, impacting these rights in ways we might not even realize at first.
Wow. So it's not just about whether my data gets used for something I personally disagree with. It's bigger than that. It's about my autonomy, my well-being, my ability to just be myself online without feeling like I'm under a microscope.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. And then we look at the impact of the data processing itself. What kind of data is being used? Is it really sensitive stuff, health info, financial info, things like that? What's the context? Is this a one-time thing, or are we talking constant monitoring, round-the-clock tracking? And what could the consequences be? Could this lead to discrimination, financial loss, even put someone's safety at risk?
Those are some heavy questions. This balancing test isn't playing around. It really makes companies think twice about how their actions could impact people in the real world.
You got it. And let's not forget about the chilling effect. That feeling of self-censoring where you hesitate to speak your mind or express yourself freely because you're worried about how your words or actions might be used against you later, even if you haven't actually done anything wrong.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like that hesitation you feel before posting something on social media.
Yeah.
That little voice that says, maybe not. Someone might misinterpret this, even if it's totally harmless.
Exactly. The guidelines recognize that this psychological impact, this chilling effect, is real, and it needs to be factored into the equation too.
So we've got my rights, my interests, the potential impact this processing could have. What's on the other side of the scale? What are companies putting up against all of that to tip the balance in their favor?
Well, a key factor here is something called your reasonable expectations. Would you, as a regular person using this website, app, or service, be surprised by how your data is being used? And this isn't about what's considered normal in a particular industry. It's about what you, as an individual, could reasonably anticipate based on your interactions with that company.
So just because everyone's doing it doesn't make it okay. It's about individual expectations, individual experiences. I like that.
Absolutely. And the guidelines have this great example. Let's say you post a photo of yourself online. Just a regular photo, nothing scandalous.
Happens to the best of us.
Now imagine a random company, one you've never even heard of, takes that photo without asking you and plasters it all over their marketing campaign.
I'll talk about a major invasion of privacy. Even though I technically shared that photo publicly, it still feels wrong.
And it is wrong. Just because you shared something publicly doesn't mean you've given every company on the planet permission to use it however they please.
Right. It's like inviting someone over for dinner and they just start rearranging your furniture. Not cool.
Exactly. And the guidelines get that. Reasonable expectations are a huge deal when we're trying to figure out if a company's interest truly, genuinely outweighs the potential impact on you.
This reasonable expectations thing, it makes me think about that example you gave earlier about online social networks using our data for those targeted ads. Even if their service is free, they might say, look, it's in our legitimate interest to personalize those ads and create a better experience for everyone. But is that really a good enough reason?
Well, according to the big dogs, the Court of Justice of the European Union, probably not. They've actually weighed in on this, saying that just because someone uses a free service, it doesn't mean they should automatically expect their data to be used for targeted advertising without their knowledge or consent.
Wow, that's huge. So many apps and websites these days are free, but rely on that whole data-driven advertising model to make money.
It's a really big deal, and it highlights one of the core messages of these guidelines. Your individual rights matter, even or maybe especially when it comes to free online services. Just because you're not whipping out your credit card every time you use a website or an app doesn't mean you've automatically signed away your data rights.
This is why I love these deep dives. We uncover those hidden assumptions, everyone knows that kind of things, and realize, wait a minute, we actually have more power than we think we do. But let's say a company goes through this whole balancing act, weighing their interests against the potential impact on users, and they come down on the side of, you know what, our interest outweighs the potential harm. Is that it? Game over.
Not quite. The guidelines actually have a pretty cool suggestion here. They say that even if a company does think they have a good reason to use your data, they should still look for ways to minimize the impact on your rights and freedoms. Think of it as like damage control, but for data privacy.
I like it. So it's not just about deciding, can we get away with this? It's about going the extra mile to protect people's data. What kind of solutions are we talking about here?
These solutions, they have to go above and beyond what the GDPR already requires. So it's not just about providing clear information or making sure people can access their own data. Those are already must-haves.
Which, of course, companies should be doing anyway, right?
Absolutely. This is about taking it a step further. For example, a company might give you granular control over your data, even letting you delete it in situations where the GDPR wouldn't strictly require it. Or they might give you more flexibility to object to the processing, even without those very specific grounds for objection laid out in Article 21.
So it's like they're giving users more power, more control to make up for the fact that they're using our data for their own purposes.
Precisely. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that fair balance where both your rights and the company's interests are respected.
Makes sense. Because at the end of the day, it's not about putting a stop to innovation or preventing companies from doing business altogether. It's about making sure they're doing it the right way, in a way that respects and protects everyday people like you and me.
Exactly. And what I really like about this approach is it encourages companies to get creative, you know? It's not just about following the bare minimum rules. It's about actually thinking, how can we use data in a way that respects people's rights from the get-go? It's like they say, a win-win, consumers feel good about it, companies build trust, and innovation doesn't have to come at the expense of privacy.
It's finding that balance, right, between like moving forward with technology and remembering that there are real people behind all those data points.
100%. And speaking of finding that balance, these guidelines don't just talk about legitimate interest in a general sense. They actually get into the weeds on some really specific situations where things might get a bit murky. Like, what about fraud prevention? Every company wants to protect themselves from those bad actors. But how does legitimate interest work when it comes to something like that?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's one thing to talk about targeted ads, but we all want companies to be able to, actually stop fraudsters.
Right, and the guidelines acknowledge that. They're not saying companies don't have a legitimate interest in preventing fraud. Of course they do. It protects their business, it protects their customers, but, and it's a big but, the bar is set really high for what qualifies as necessary processing in this context.
So it's not just a matter of yelling fraud, and suddenly all bets are off.
Definitely not. Remember that data minimization principle we talked about earlier? Yeah, that's especially important here. Companies can't just start hoarding mountains of data just in case it might reveal some kind of fraudulent activity down the road. They've got to be laser focused, proving that the data they're collecting is absolutely essential for preventing that very specific type of fraud they've identified. No fishing expeditions allowed.
So no more sweeping data collection under the guise of better safe than sorry.
Exactly. Targeted, proportionate. That's the name of the game, according to the guidelines. And when it comes to actually reporting suspected fraud to the authorities, the data they use has to be accurate, it has to be relevant, no guesswork, no assumptions.
It's like that whole innocent until proven guilty thing, but for data. You can't just treat everyone like a potential criminal.
Exactly. And you can't just wave the fraud prevention flag to justify gathering way more data than you actually need. That balancing test we talked about earlier still applies, even in cases of potential fraud. Companies still have to weigh their interest in stopping those bad actors against the potential impact all that data collection might have on your rights and freedoms. Speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about another hot topic that's on everyone's minds. Direct marketing. You know, those emails that magically appear in your inbox, those ads that seem to follow you around the internet. Where does legitimate interest fit in with all of that?
Yeah, because we all get those. Sometimes they're spot on, sometimes they're hilariously off base, but they're definitely a thing.
They are definitely a thing. And this is where things get, well, extra interesting because the rules around direct marketing, they're actually affected by a bunch of things. There's the GDPR, of course, but there's also this thing called the e-privacy directive, which specifically focuses on electronic communications.
Oh, right. So it's not just the GDPR calling the shots in this case.
Right. For example, the e-privacy directive generally says you need to get someone's consent before you go sending them marketing emails or using those sneaky tracking technologies. I'm looking at you, Cookies.
So those little opt-in boxes we see all the time for email subscriptions, that's the e-privacy directive doing its thing.
You got it. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? There are some exceptions to that rule. Like if someone's already a customer, a company might be able to send them marketing emails about their own similar products or services without getting separate consent. But even then, they have to have been super clear about that possibility up front and given people a way to opt out if they're not into it.
So even with those exceptions, it's still all about transparency and giving people a choice.
100%. And that's where the GDPR and the Privacy Directive, they work hand in hand. Even if a company can legally send those marketing emails without getting your explicit consent every single time, they still need to have a solid justification under the GDPR for how they're processing your data in the first place.
Which probably means going through that whole balancing test again.
Yeah.
Right. Weighing their interest in marketing to you against your rights and freedoms as a user.
You know it. And here's the good news. The GDPR, it gives you a secret weapon. Well, maybe not so secret, but it's powerful. That weapon is your right to object. You can say no thanks to direct marketing whenever you want. End of story. Doesn't matter if they're trying to rely on legitimate interest or some other justification. You've got the power to say, no, not for me.
Music to my ears. So we're not totally powerless against those endless marketing emails and targeted ads.
Not at all. And it gets even better. Remember that right to erasure we touched on earlier? That comes into play here too. You can actually ask a company to delete your data in certain situations, like if they don't need it anymore for the original reason they collected it, or if you've objected to the processing and they don't have a really compelling reason to hold on to it anymore.
It's all about putting the control back in the hands of individuals, giving us a say in how our data gets used.
Exactly. And these rights, they're even more crucial when a company is trying to rely on legitimate interest, because it means they've got to be extra careful, extra transparent. They've really got to prove they're not overstepping boundaries or taking people's data for granted. Speaking of protecting those who need it most, we can't forget about the group that's often most vulnerable online: kids. We all know how much data gets collected these days, and kids, well, they need extra protection, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Kids and data, and something we need to be really, really careful about. So how do these guidelines address that? How do they make sure companies are prioritizing children's best interests?
The guidelines are crystal clear on this one. When it comes to children's data, the bar is set sky high. And I mean sky high. Their well-being, their safety, their rights, those come first every single time. No compromises.
So no more treating kids like miniature adults when it comes to data protection.
Exactly. Article 6.1, it actually spells it out. The balancing test, that whole weighing of interests we've been talking about, yeah, it needs to be extra rigorous when children are involved. A company's interest in using their data, even for something that seems harmless on the surface, it's very, very rarely going to outweigh the potential risks to a child's development, their well-being, their right to just be a kid.
So things like extensive profiling or targeted advertising aimed specifically in children, those are basically off limits.
For the most part, you got it. The guidelines, they really discourage those practices, and for good reason, because they can have a serious impact on a child's autonomy, their development, their right to a safe and healthy online environment. It's about protecting their childhood, you know? Protecting their privacy, protecting their potential.
Couldn't agree more. We need to build a digital world where kids can explore, where they can learn, where they can connect, but without feeling like they're constantly being targeted or manipulated.
Absolutely. And these guidelines, they're a big step towards making that vision a reality.
This has been amazing. Seriously. We've covered so much ground today, from the ins and outs of what legitimate interest actually means to how this all plays out in the real world. Those tricky situations involving fraud, direct marketing, and of course making sure we're protecting children online.
It's complex stuff, no doubt about it. And remember, this conversation, it doesn't end here. As technology keeps evolving, which it always does, right? The way our data is used will keep evolving too. And so will the laws that are designed to protect us.
And for our amazing listeners who want to take an even deeper dive into all things legitimate interest, we'll link to the full EDPB guidelines and other helpful resources in our show notes. As always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of data protection.
Until next time, happy diving.